So, if this is working, I'm going to check the technology, then we'll jump in just because, yeah. So, obviously, the semester is about to start. And if you're one of my students and you're seeing this, I'm distracted by producing things that people asked me to about the Kids Book project for another college. So, this video and the one that I'm about to produce after it are totally based on things that were specific requests from me, and it doesn't mean that I don't have Canvas course shells to build or final assignments to finalize before CGC starts its semester next week. That being said, this is what I'm doing right now because sometimes you just got to do it. And I want to make sure it sounds right. So now that I've rambled, we can get rid of that. That sounds fine. So let's talk about this. This video will be about the textual production options you can have when you are doing the prototyping of a book. If you're trying to create a minimum viable prototype or minimum functional prototype. So for my students or anyone using a kids book project to reinforce content or just a kids book project, one of the challenges is that this would connect to what I describe as the technological aspect of writing and the process of production. And we can go through the history of writing technologies, but there are videos on that other places on my channel. So what I'd like to do is talk about the real practical hands-on thing. Now there are some people, just to frame this, there are some people who will not see this as a writing thing. They will see this differently, so because it is not the crafting of words. So let's throw back to the Greeks and make a distinction. So writing, and it's in the way we think of it as well-formed words and phrases and sentences, is what might be linked to the Greek term graphia. It's where we get graffiti from. And so there's this, it literally does mean to carve out or scratch out on a wax tablet, but it has a weight to it that has to do with the meaning more than just the act. That's in comparison to a Greek word called glypho, which has to do with, like, it's the word you use for like stone carving and etching. And that has a sense of permanence to it, and there's a tactile reinforcer there too. So you've got, and so what usually shows up here is a distinction between graphia that has to do with forming words in a way that are meaningful and effective. And so we would call that the content of something. And then we have the form of something, which might be closer to a glypho situation. And so we're going to talk about kind of the glypho side of it, recognizing that a text is experienced in a variety of ways. And kids' books, especially when we're trying to take, not just have a thought and an idea and do some intellectual work, but make it meaningful and put it in the hands of other people. Pause. And put it in the hands of other people. Then we will have a real meaningful text, and it does marry the two. So there are writing proficiencies that are graphia oriented and writing proficiencies that are glypho oriented in the development of content and the production side of it in its form. And so we want to keep that in mind, and you know, some of the scholarship on form versus content over the last 20 or 30 years has been oriented more or complicated more because it's really focusing on word processing, content or form, or thinking about MLA or APA format, not so much form in the sense of actual textual production. So we're going to look at some of these options. The lowest, and I don't mean to assess any of these student works as bad or negative, but some of them had more time, some of them had less time, some of them had access to technology differences. And so we'll just look at what we have. So so one version, like this is a fun story. The content of the story, Rob learns about colors, is all about a bear who's going through and learning about color. Now the student needed me to print it out, and the first time I printed it out, we were kind of in a time crunch as we were walking over to meet with the students. And the first time I printed it out, the first printer was a black and white only printer. So this was the example we got as a usable prototype. And that's no fun. So we caught that with just barely enough time to get a color version, but we almost had to use this with the students. And so it's not like the message wasn't good. It's not like the story didn't do its job or help talk about color theory in a way that was approachable for the audience, but the production here is meaningful. Now, if you compare this as it's not stapled, it's the least common denominator possible here. This was produced in Google Slides. So recognizing that part of the textual production in Google Slides automatically presets the page size to be funny like this, where you've got excessive borders on the top and bottom. You want to be aware when you're setting up a document and creating content that you're going to eventually print, you have to think about the end goal, that you can change the page setup, page size of what you're printing. And if it's the default setting, it's going to come out like this, and you're going to have to cut this off, which is what this person did, right? So this person had that same trouble, but they had a little bit more time and a little bit more color, and they were able to produce that in the same technology using Google Slides, and then cut it to fit. And so we can see a bit more variety here with that. And there was also, and some of this they ended up doing just a little bit of print and then hand building. Now we can also look at how these books are bound together. Like I said, the one I showed, the first example, had no staples. So you're literally leafing through, and that actually becomes a problem if there are no page numbers as well. If you accidentally drop this, or you hand it to a kid to read if they were reading around in a group. And so that process of the user experience for that is going to be very different than a book that's been bound at all, even just with staples. And so we can look at this, and it's fairly usable to go and flip through. And we could talk about some of the use of font, but we're not going to do that now because I'm primarily focused on what the book produced looks like. The rest is closer to the content. Developing visual design is still kind of a blend, is closer to Glypho, but it is a blend of Graphia and Glypho, the physical production side of it. We're going to lean hard into that side for now. But staples, at a minimum, are going to make this project that much more usable and easier to pass around a group, and let each kid read a page and move on. And the art here is really fun and colorful, and so those are good choices. Now, one of the challenges if we've got second or third graders sometimes is these staples sometimes don't do what they're supposed to. And the last thing I want is a second grader who catches their finger on the edge of a staple, and suddenly my book has blood all over it. But that is a legitimate concern based on the user experience for this type of technology. The process of production leaves that as a problem. Now, some people wouldn't consider that a writing content or writer expertise consideration. But how your reader engages with the text does matter. And it's not uncommon to ask whether your reader is going to be digging into this, looking at your thing on social media or through email or on a phone versus a tablet versus a laptop. Well, this is another version of that. So if you're doing a kid's project or a book like this or anything that's tactile, you do want to think about how you're binding the materials together. And so some ways that other people have solved that problem, but we still have loose leaf. We still have here's one actually before we go to that. We still have people also, so this is how this person dealt with, they just kept the sheet big and had different pages and they just left all the white space. It does give you a little more to hang on to, which can be good, but it doesn't have the same polish that the ones that are trimmed off do. We also have people who would use this, where's one? Here's another version. So if we're going back to binding, this is one option. Someone was able to change the page design layout, and they did use staples in here, and this one's a couple years old now, but they used tape and staples, I think, to connect these, and they let this one page wrap all the way around. Actually, I'm wrong. Hold on, let me look. I'm trying to see if I pull back the cover. So actually, they did a lot more glue to glue on this, so no, I don't have any staples. So they did this more in a traditional book binding style, where you fold the pages like this and then you connect them, and sometimes you connect them with tape on the ends, but that's not what they did. But for the first couple pages, they glued them all together like you see here, right? Just make sure the light allows for that. And then they put them all together so that it has a little bit more substance. It's something you can flip through the pages. It does create it looks like they might have done just a little bit of taping or gluing to keep some of those pages together. And every now and then it does create a situation where you have to flip a little extra. As a prototype, that's probably fine, and you're looking at how that interacts, right? But this is a much cleaner edge. It takes a little more work, but it does get you closer to a more traditional, the way books are bound together. Sometimes they're sewed in batches of 16 or 50 pages at a time, depending on what technology you have. So they'll sew chunks of pages together, and then connect those chunks together separately, and then wrap it all in some sort of binding. And so that's one way you could produce a book if you got just a tiny bit more time to do that versus staple it. It can be better. Now, I also have students, while we're still talking about binding, I have some students who just forego the, like this student made sure to change the page size so that it filled a full 8.5 by 11. So that was a good design choice. This is also a student who was able to take advantage of some eye tracking software for some peer feedback in the process. And so the design in the pages was adapted to better draw the reader's attention to where the writer wanted them to go. But for the sake of binding and talking about how this thing was put together, these pieces of ribbon actually have done a pretty solid job of holding them together. It's not too wiggly, like it keeps it together. You can turn the pages, and this one's easily 2 years old as well. And so, and I've let other students use this book when they didn't have one on the day of the service learning with my with 3rd or 5th graders that we have going on. So pretty solid work here, right? Even just 2 hole punches and some good, well-tied ribbon can be better than staples. There's no danger of hurting yourself or anything like that. Let me see. So then we have 2 other options when it comes to binding specifically, and then I'll talk about covers maybe. And so one version of binding can also be a more traditional, it's just a 3-ring binder with leaflets or with 3-hole punch, and then these nice fun plastic things, pretty standard, not uncommon for school supplies, right? And so we can flip through here and look and see that this student is still using the Google Slides page layout. You can see that they've hand-drawn most of these and then digitized them to add the text and play with that. And then they slip these into these 3-hole punch page holders. And that makes it nice and flippable. It doesn't have the polished feel of some of these other books, but it is contained. It does have a nice, it is easier to hold, easier to pass around, and it's materials that students would already have available to them if they can print the storybook out, on regular 8.5 by 11. So that's one of the positives of just using a binder, turning it like this, and making it feel like you can 3-hole punch it. There's not a substantial concern about like students, kids getting their fingers caught in the 3-hole punch the same way staples are, but that's an option, right? What else? Actually, so similar to the one we saw already, this was this was an extra that a student had. So they asked me to print one, and I printed it too small, so I had this little micro book. And so I actually played with the technology for this, and I just used Scotch tape because it was during office hours and a student was hanging out, so we just decided to have fun with it. And I had to make sure the pages lined up in the right order. That was a part of this. And I scotch taped at the front of the pages. And you want to see here. So each of these I taped on the back of the front, on the back of the front portion of the page. That way the actual, because otherwise the problem I was going to have was that this binding, where the what's that part called on a book? The spine of the book. I'm a professional. The spine of the book, would be overly weighted, and then the cover wouldn't come out far enough to overlap the pages. I had tried with one version, and because of all the extra tape, it was pulling it back so that it had this kind of funny, like 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch overlap. And so instead, we get a little bit more cleanness to that page. And this student just did a really great job on the visual design, and I wanted to see if I could make a small booklet like that. So we had tapes on the ends, and that's how that went. The last version of binding is I had a student actually just get a book binding kit. And so they have this, they actually created this using cardboard cover, and it's a whole kit where they had the overlapping glue or adhesive paper to attach it to the cardboard cover. And then if you were going to try and do this on your own, if you didn't have a kit, that's something like double-sided tape could work. And it looks like they might have also reinforced it with some form of like gaffer's tape that you might see in like theater, or just a fancy like textured duct tape. And I feel like there's another name for it that I'm spacing on right now, but I'm used to hearing it be like wide gaffer's tape or something. or gaff tape. Um, so those are some of the options when you're binding. And then they did take, it looks like on the cardboard, they did just basically do an adhesive on the back of this page. The way they've done it, it feels to me like they've done a spray adhesive on the back and then slowly laid it over because there are no wrinkles or anything. And so that's really uncommon if you print it yourself with regular adhesive, even if you've got glue sticks, but it's possible. But sometimes what you can do, and I've done this in theater productions with really large stage poster type things, is instead of painting really complex things, we did wide print format and we spray adhesive and very carefully laid it on like you would a decal or like you would if you were tinting windows. It's the same kind of process. So spray adhesive is always an option if you're careful with it. Watch out for overspray. But this student, because they were thinking about binding, it gave it this really nice solid cardboard. I wasn't trying to do the ASMR thing, I'm sorry. Solid cardboard cover, and then all of these pages were nicely bound. And I don't know if they did that by the looks of it. They might have done some sort of stapling. Yeah, it looks like they stapled those all together and then used the extra paper that went onto the cover. They overlapped to keep that kind of whole chunk in. So kind of like we were talking about with how some people will bind or sew together chunks of paper. They kind of did that, but with staples, and they covered the staples with the binding so that they were no longer issues. And you could do that with something like this as well. So even if you've got the staples like this one does, you could just put a piece of ribbon, a piece of duct tape, even a piece of just paper folded over twice to give it a little more thickness on the spine, and then cover, like glue that part or tape that part and cover the staples. So let the staples hold all the core meat of the story together, and then do something different with the binding and the cover. Now this student used construction paper that was a little thicker for their cover, and so they doubled up on it. So that did make this a little better, like thick, a little bit easier to use when like the pages are solid, but the cover gives it a little more durability. So again, this is all about the process of producing these texts. And depending on what your goal is, if you're just trying to make one and see if the story works and make it functional, like you could do something like this. You could just have papers and staples, but you could also make it just a little more durable or a little bit more user-friendly in a binder using cardboard and things you might find around the house. I've done things with cereal box covers, and covered and done like an adhesive or a glue stick around the edges to put the cover I wanted on, just to give it a little more durability. So those are always options. And if we're thinking back through history, before we could print things, if we're going all the way back to like the sacking of the library in Alexandria, so I want to say that's history. It's not, I want to say it's 420 AD or something real close to that. But they found that the things that got lit on fire best were scrolls that could have air in and didn't have as much cover or coating. And then things called codexes, which are, or things like that, basically books that had animal skin pages, maybe some papyrus pages, but then the whole thing was had wood on both sides and then animal skin wrapping the whole thing, and all of that either soaked in wax or oil of some kind. Like that resisted the fire, and those texts stood the test of time and the elements a lot better, whether it was bugs or water or heat. So, there's one last one that I didn't mention. So one thing you can do is also, sometimes you can go to a print shop and they will do, like Kinko's will do this kind of thing where you have like this nice little spirally bound thing. This does give it a more polished look, and there's not that same issue where you have the possibility of hurting your hand on staples. It feels nice, and often they come with like this clear or semi-clear front. If you don't necessarily like that for a kid's book, then, that's your prerogative. But it is better than staples, and it has definitely, this is one of the more durable stories I have. With that, those are some of the ways you could produce a text like these, especially if they're prototype texts. You're trying to see if it's functional, see how students engage with it. If you notice, there are some students who took who took some of the design and page sizing into their own hands and made this something that was more vertical, and others went with a more traditional, just stuck with the size that Google Slides would give and didn't change that. And some people don't realize until they go to print it out and then they're triaging, which is a very normal process. It's part of the experience of producing something like this, is realizing, oh, the technology does this. So also just trying to figure out how to print front and back for some people becomes a meaningful part of this process. Trying to figure out how to set up the printer so it gives you what you want. Like that is a whole, people don't necessarily think that of as a writer consideration, but the production of that and being able to do that smoothly, like if it's materials for a business meeting and you can't get it to print both sides, sometimes that'll seem less professional. And so having that as just a fundamental core writer practice and being able to engage with technology as a 21st century writer, like it's hard not to count that as writing. And it does reflect poorly if the product you're trying to hand out to a CEO at a company or to a new client is kind of, printed kind of funny. So if or where they're like, why did we waste 20 pages on this? That kind of thing. So with that, this is digging into the possible textual production options as we think about writing technologies and what it means to compare creating the content of a text, the graphia, the messaging, and that sort of thing, and comparing that to glypho, which is that set in stone, more permanent, creating some product that we are tangibly experiencing and engaging with. And so those two words, just to help create some distinction, can give us a sense of like both of them fall under what 21st century writers might need as experiences, as proficiencies, and expertise. So keep pushing forward. Hopefully this was helpful and made you think a little bit differently about what it means to be a writer in the 21st century. Not every technology a writer needs is only digital, even though it's 21st century. Sometimes we still have to think about user experience in a very tactile way. Have fun. Enjoy your day.